We are glad you're here. Thank you for being in here. This is our new quarter starting today, and Lee Hickerson and I will be leading a study in here, as you see up on the screen, Genesis, a fresh approach. And Lee is out today. When I asked him to join me in teaching this class, he said, well, I'll join you, but I'm going to miss the very first one. And I said, well, that's all right. We can get through with that. So Lee will be joining us next week. But let me explain a little bit about why I wanted to do this study. Genesis is one of the foundational books of the Bible. I mean, if you go back to the Old Testament, you can't do without the book of Genesis. But I'm afraid that one of the problems we have, and it seems to be just multiplying in our world. I mean, I appreciated Tim's comments this morning as he talked about all the things that we are so split and divided and having trouble with in our world. One of the problems we have when we read the book of Genesis is that oftentimes we don't read it the way we need to read it. And I'll explain why I'm saying that here in just a few moments. And so I remember as a student many, many years ago when I was working on my master's degree, taking the book of Genesis under a brilliant professor. And unfortunately, I was simply not at the stage of where I could appreciate what he was teaching. I mean, it was all flying over my head. And I remember going home and telling June, wow, I didn't get anything out of class today. And the reason for that is that I simply wasn't thinking, reasoning, looking at Genesis the way that the professor was trying to challenge us to do that. So I want to do an introductory lesson today on the book of Genesis. Welcome to Genesis, as I'm calling it. And I want to begin with this question. How do you read and interpret a book like Genesis? How do you even begin to do that? And I'm afraid that what a lot of us do is we just open our Bible up and we just start reading it without preparing ourselves to read it. And if you do that, you end up reading Genesis this way, through rose-tinted glasses. And by the way, that's the way we do everything. I carry readers with me all the time. These are my readers, a special kind called Click, because you don't lose them this way. I don't know if you have to wear readers, but I do, and I was always losing them. And then one day I saw somebody who had this pair on. They got up to do, I think, a communion talk, and they did this, and I thought, what in the world? And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world, and so I started buying Click readers. And the only thing bad about Click readers, if you have young grandchildren, they love them. They love the magnets. And so they're constantly grabbing them doing this, and they'll stretch them and they'll do this, and they'll stretch them. By the way, you know what happens if you stretch it too far? Breaks on the backside, and you have to buy a new pair at $40 a pair. So June the other day, I had about 3 or 4 pairs of Clicks on the desk, all of them broken by my grandkids. And June said, can I throw these away now? And I said, yeah, you can throw them away now, okay? But we all put a special type of glasses on when we read stuff. And oftentimes it distorts what we're reading. You see, if I were to describe right now what I'm seeing right now is blurry people. Because these are readers. These help me see right here. I can see as clear as day right here. But if I look out here, all I see is blurry faces. I have to take off my glasses to see you clearly. Okay. We have to take off our rose-tinted glasses, which means that we have got to ask the question, how is the proper way, or what is the proper way to read a book like Genesis? Let me illustrate. How many of you had to read this book when you were in high school? Anybody? Okay, several of you did. If you took a course on communism, you read this book, George Orwell's Animal Farm. Now, here's what's interesting about this. If you don't know the background to this book, if you just went up to Books A Million, got this book off the book rack, and opened it up and started reading it, you would go, this is the weirdest thing in the world. What in the world is this book about? And it's about, I'll just give you, if you haven't read it, spoiler alert, if you don't want to listen to what it's about, close your ears, because I'm fixing to tell you. George Orwell wrote this back during, I'm wanting to guess, probably the late 40s or through the 50s. I don't know the exact publishing date of it. But when he wrote the book, He wrote a book about farm animals. Farm animals who had spent all their life under the farmer's control. And so the farm animals one day decided they would rise up and kick the farmer off the farm. They overthrow the farmer, and the animals take over. And so the animals get together, and they decide who's going to lead the animals. And you've got the horses, and you've got the chickens, and the donkeys, and the pigs, and the geese, and all the animals on the farm. And they vote as to who's going to lead them, and they vote in the pigs. Okay? And so the pigs become the leader on the farm. And the whole point's going to be we're all going to contribute to the farm life, and we're all going to reap the benefits of it. In other words, the farmer is not going to reap the benefits of all of our hard labor. And so the pigs take over, but as the pigs take over, the pigs begin to act more like the farmer than they do pigs. And so when you get to the end of the book, you have the animals looking through the window into the room where farmers from other farms have come in, and they're playing cards, you see, with the pigs, and they're discussing how to make more money on their farms. And if you'll notice, the pigs are dressed up in suits, they're playing cards, they're eating food. The pigs look more like humans than they do look like pigs. The point of the story is communism. Russia. This was written right in the middle of the Cold War. And it was about how that the people in Russia rose up against the Tsar, got rid of the Tsar, and then using Marx's book, they came to the conclusion that let's just all work together where everyone is equal and everyone shares together and there's no one who lives better than everyone else. Sounds good, doesn't it? Until Stalin came to power. And the next thing you know, the pigs are acting like the czars used to act. And so basically it's a book that's a parable. Now, if you don't know that, and you just pick it up and read it, you're going, what in the world is this about? And it's because you haven't prepared yourself to read it. Again, I read it in civics class, and I still remember it from all those years ago. All right, you got to do the same thing with Genesis. Now, I want to begin by just talking about some basic rules of how do you read any book, but especially the Bible. What are the basic rules of exegesis? These are what helps you put yourself with the proper glasses so that you can read the text. All right, here we go. Rule number 1, historical context. What are we dealing with here? Now, I could ask Rodney to stand up and hold up his Bible because his Bible's closer to my Bible than what we're dealing with here. He's got a Bible. When he came in this morning, I looked at it, and on the front of it says Tanakh. And you go, it says what? Tanakh. And you go, Tanakh or not Tanakh? No, not Tanakh, which stands for Torah, stands for the historical books, the prophets, and then stands for the writings. All in Hebrew put together, Tanakh. It's how Jews refer to what we call the Old Testament. And so we're dealing with the Tanakh. Now, in particular here, I've got the first 5 books pictured, which the Jewish people call the Torah. Torah simply means law, okay? And so the first 5 books of the Old Testament, if you were Jewish, would be called the Torah. And Torah means law, translated oftentimes as Pentateuch, which Pentateuch in Greek simply means the 5 scrolls. If you'd gone into any synagogue, if you go into any synagogue today, they will have scrolls, still to this day, they'll have scrolls of these Old Testament books. And so you've got a scroll of Genesis, you've got a scroll of Exodus, you've got a scroll of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay? And so the word penta means 5. We have a Pentagon up in Washington, 5-sided building that houses our Defense Department. So Pentateuch simply means 5 scrolls. And the first one is called Genesis. Now, that's the Greek name of it. The Hebrew name of it is Bereshit. And by the way, the Hebrews would always name their books based on the first words of the book. And so, again, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. Rodney here is. He could get up here and just tell you what all of them are, just one right after the other. I can't do that. I wished I could, but my specialty was not Old Testament. I tried to focus on New Testament when I was going through school. And plus, I didn't go to school near as long as Rodney did. Rodney went to school. I'm pretty sure you thought he was never going to get through, didn't you? Yeah. I know my mother one time said to me, "Are you ever going to stop going to school?" And I'm like, "Well, Mom, I'm going to try." All right, so you got Genesis, Bereshit, in the beginning, okay? Now, that's what we're dealing with. And Genesis is the story of Israel and her God. It's the beginning of the story. Here is who Israel is, and here is who her God is. Now, one of the things fascinating about Genesis, notice the word Genesis. Genesis has a series of what we call genealogies or beginnings. I mean, you've got all of these generations, these genealogies in the book of Genesis. And the book is kind of divided up like that in order to teach, again, Israel about who she is and who her God is. Notice Genesis 2:4. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. Genesis 6:9. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of Shem. These are the generations of Terah, who is the father of Abram, who becomes Abraham. These are the generations of Ishmael, Abram's son through Hagar. These are the generations of Isaac, the generations of Esau, the generations of Jacob. And so one of the ways of just reading the book is looking at how it describes all of these important components in the life of Israel. I'm a genealogist. I'm my family's historian. So people call me or contact me or see me if they have family questions. Started doing that, my mother actually started it before me many, many years ago. But if you've ever done genealogical work, you discover very quickly that you're not just doing the genealogy of the Chapmans. You see, my family name is Chapman. Just so that you know, Chapman means salesperson. If you lived back in ancient England, you said, "Boy, I need to buy a new pot." Well, when the Chapman comes by, you can buy it from him. These were just the guys who came around with wagons selling stuff. That's how the name Chapman came about. That's why there's a lot of genetic differences in people whose last names are Chapman. It's like Smith. I mean, if your name is Smith, you got the name because someone in your background used to be a black Smith. In other words, John the Smith became John Smith. That's just kind of the way names develop. Okay, now that's my family, my father's name. My mother's name is Story, S-T-O-R-E-Y. And so I am made up of the generations of the Chapmans and the generations of the Story. But if you take the Chapman side, sure, my grandfather's a Chapman. My paternal grandmother's a Mooney. M-A-U-E-Y, Mooney. Now, M-A-U-N-E-Y. I can't even spell it. By the way, when they came over, it spelled M-U-N-N-I. Kind of like that spelling better. But now I've got to trace that line. On my mother's side, it's Bullock. And each generation you go up, you spread out more and more. That's exactly what they're doing. Here's all the people who relate to Israel. And here's how they came about, and here's who descended from them. Very important point if you're trying to tell a people who they are. I remember several years ago, I was over at Northside, and a lady came to me, and she said, "Could you run my genealogy?" I said, "Sure." She said, "When could we do that?" I said, "Right now." She said, "You do it that fast?" I said, "Sure." And so we went back to the office. I pulled up Ancestry.com. I kicked her name in, and here we went. And we'd been there about 10 minutes, and I looked, and I thought, "Wow, that's odd." And she said, "What?" I said, "You've got a great-great-great-grandmother. It's the same name as my great-great-grandmother, living in the same county as my great-great-grandmother, at the same time of my great-great-grandmother." And she said, "That is odd, isn't it?" And I said, "Hang on a minute." And I said, "Let's see who your great-grandmother's great-great-grandmother's dad's name is and who mine is." And guess what? We discovered we were cousins. Now, we were sixth cousins. And if you're sixth cousins, that means that if there was any money in the will, you're getting a penny. Okay? That's how far back it goes. But we were still cousins. And to this day, every time I see her, I say, "Hey, cuz." She tells me, "Hey, cuz." Because we share a same great-great-great-grandmother. That's what's going on here in this text. Question number 2. So, who is the book being written to? This is where we've got to get very specific. You turn to Mark chapter 1, or who wrote the book, not who it's being written to, but who wrote it. You turn to Mark 12, and Jesus describes these Old Testament books as the books of Moses. Notice, now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses? And then he goes over to the book of Exodus and quotes from Exodus. But notice Jesus calls these the books of Moses. Now, some people would say, well, that could be books about Moses, and that would be true. But you've got multiple places that refer to Moses as being an author of a good bit of it. John 7:19, notice Jesus again, has not Moses given you the law, given you the Torah? And so you've got Moses as, according to Jesus, the author of these books. But here's the one thing you need to realize, that while Moses was told to write these words down in accordance with the words I've made a covenant with you and with Israel, one of the things you have to ask, though, is this, and that is, did Moses author the Pentateuch as we have it today? And my answer to that is most likely no. I probably should be stronger than that, but I'm going to leave it as most likely no. And the reason is simply this, and this is something you need to understand about inspiration. I've got some good brethren that if you suggest anything different than the way they've been taught, you're not being biblical. I remember years ago teaching the book of Luke, Rodney, and I talked about how that Luke even states in the very beginning how that he had thoroughly investigated everything that had been written about Jesus and then wrote it down. And I said, and very likely he looked at Mark and used Mark as kind of the outline and then expanded from there. And I had a brother who came in and said, you don't believe in inspiration. And I said, what do you mean I don't believe in inspiration? He said, you don't believe in inspiration because you believe that Luke investigated it and used other sources. And I said, well, I only believe that because Luke said he did. And he said, well, you don't believe in inspiration. Listen, I believe in inspiration. I just believe that God can use more than one person and one means in order to produce a book. Let me illustrate why. Here's Deuteronomy 34, 5 and 6. Now I want you to look at the text and tell me if Moses wrote this. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab. As the Lord had said, he buried him in Moab in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Now, if Moses had written that, wouldn't he have used first person singular? I was buried there. That's where the Lord buried me. But that's not what he said. I mean, Moses is spoken of as being dead. And by the way, notice the last phrase there, but to this day. In other words, someone is editing the book, and they're editing it long after Moses is dead. Watch another example. This is Genesis 36:31. These were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. What? I mean, when Moses wrote this, you are still hundreds of years from a king reigning in Israel. And yet here in Genesis, they describe the kings of the Edomites and says, by the way, this is before anyone reigned in Israel, indicating whoever's editing this is editing it during the time of the kings. And so all that means is that, did Moses write the book? Yeah, Moses wrote most of it, but it was very likely edited later on by someone else. Okay? And so, and that person was inspired by the Spirit as Moses was. So don't think that this is somehow a denial of inspiration. It is not. Now, here's what we need to know about Moses, though. Of all the people God chose to lead his people out of Egypt, he chose one of the smartest men alive at that time period. Moses was born an Israelite. We all know that. It was during the time where all the baby boys were being thrown in the Nile. But his mother instead put him in, or had him put in a little boat, a little ark, and sent him out into the Nile, where Pharaoh's daughter would find him, who then adopted him, still used his own biological mother to nurse him, but then took him into Pharaoh's house, and he was raised under Pharaoh's authority. Look at how Stephen describes him. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Here was a man, as far as his education was concerned, he was a Harvard graduate of his day. He went to the best schools. He knew how to read, he knew how to write, he knew history, he knew languages. Here was a man who was as educated as anyone would have been educated in the ancient world. Interesting that God would work through that in order to have him lead his people out. And so don't underestimate how smart Moses was. I think he was an incredibly intelligent man, all through the providential work of God. And then historical context number 3, to whom? And here's where we've got to nail it down real hard. Okay? You need to understand who is the first readers, the first recipients of these works. And the answer to that question is given to us in the book. Then the Lord said to Moses, write down these words, for in accordance with these words I've made a covenant with you and with Israel. I mean, one of the things you find as you're reading through the Pentateuch is God constantly saying, write it down, 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 write it down. And so Moses, being the man he was able to do that. And so you have these 5 books written, and of course, when they were written, I personally think they were written from the time Moses had led the Israelites out at Mount Sinai to the end, right before he died. Moses was writing down the travel stories, the history, the law, all the experiences of the Israelite people. Edited later? Yes. Did Joshua finish the story? Very likely, yes. Or at least someone shortly after he died. But at the same time, it was written to a group of people known as the Israelites. Now, here's why that's important. Israel doesn't have a clue who she is. She knows that she is descended from people named Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But she has no written record. No written record. She finds herself in very difficult times. We'll talk about that here in a moment. She is basically uneducated as far as academic education. Now, skilled in abilities to build things, yes, but not in the sense of Moses' education. And so let's look at what the text tells us about it. First of all, who is Israel? Exodus 3:6. Moses meets with God there on Mount Sinai. And God says to him, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And can I tell you that beyond that, Israel probably knew very little as to who she was. She was the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And by the way, I don't know if you were raised like I was. When I was a kid, used to go to Pew Packer's class on Sunday night, and we would sing about the patriarchs. There was a song we used to sing called, Once There Were 3 Wandering Jews. Now, I wish I was smart enough to say back then, you need to change it to Once There Were 3 Wandering Hebrews. Okay? They weren't Jews yet. But anyway, we took the liberty to change the word there. But we'd sing the song about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and we learned who the forefathers of Israel was. Notice in particular the last one, Jacob. Jacob, as he's coming back from Laban and he's entering back into the promised land, a man says to him, he's wrestling with an angel all night long. And the man basically says, you need to let me go. And he says, I'm not going to let you go until you bless me. And he says, okay, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. Abram, exalted father. Abraham, father of many nations. Isaac, laughter. I love that name. If you remember when God showed up and said, Abram, this time next year, Sarah, your wife, will have a child. Abraham laughed, Sarah laughed, and God said, okay, because you laughed, you're going to name him Laughter. And so Isaac simply means laughter. And then Jacob comes along, and of course Jacob, when he's born, he's one of twins, and his brother Esau comes out first, and when he comes out, he grabs his heel. And because of that, they named him the one who trips you up. And of course later became known as the deceiver. That's why I like to pick on people who make fun of my name, Leslie. I don't know if you know what Leslie means. Leslie is a British name. It goes back to England, Scotland in particular. There's several names that go with Leslie. There's Wesley and Leslie and different names like that. Well, a Lee is a meadow. And so a Wesley is a western meadow. A Stanley is a grand meadow. And a Leslie is a little bitty meadow. I've got a friend who every time he sees me, he calls me Little Meadow. Little Meadow, how you doing? Well, that's what my name means. Well, Jacob's name, by the way, if any of the men in here are named James, James is simply the New Testament name of Jacob, and it means the deceiver, the one who trips you up. And so I like to point out, okay, if you want to make fun of my name, I can make fun of your name as well. But anyway, he becomes the name Israel. And Israel means one who struggles with God. E-L on the end of a name goes back to the name of God. God is Elohim. And so if you've got an E-L on the end of your name, it's going back to God's name. And so Israel is the one who wrestles, who struggles with God. And that's the name he's given it. And of course, that's the name that the nation took on. Now, to understand that, you simply need to look at his descendants. Jacob, you remember, ends up marrying two sisters. He wants to marry Rachel. Unfortunately, he wakes up the morning after the wedding, and Rachel's older sister is laying there beside him, Leah. And he looks at her and goes, "How did you get here?" And of course, I'm sure her response was, "You married me." And his response was, "No, I didn't." And they said, "Oh, yes, you did. You didn't realize, you didn't look under the veil, did you?" Now, y'all, I have to admit, to this day, I don't have a clue how he could marry her, spend the first night with her, and not know the next morning who she was. Says something about the traditions of the time, okay? But he ends up marrying both Leah and then Rachel, and then they get into a children contest. Who can have the most children? And that involves their handmaids as well, their slaves. And you see Zilpah and Bilhah there in between them. And to those are born your 12 sons of Israel and one daughter, Dinah, who came through Leah. And so to Jacob and his 4 wives, 2 wives and then kind of 2 concubines, are born these 12 sons. And these 12 sons will become the children of Israel. Now, you have to study that history just a little bit because God's going to eventually kind of mess it up. You see, we oftentimes talk about the 12 tribes of Israel, actually 13 tribes. And you go, 13 tribes? Yeah, it's actually 13. Because God needed a tribe to serve as the Levites or as kind of the people who would work the tabernacle and the temple, and he ended up choosing the Levites to be that tribe. And so he took the Levites as his own, which reduced the number of tribes to 11 because God's taken the Levites, and then he took Joseph's tribe and he split it in half. And you see it up here. You see Joseph right over here on the left, Manasseh on the right, but you see Joseph there to the left of Benjamin. Manasseh and Ephraim, 2 of the tribes came from that. And so you really have 13 tribes, but Levite belonged to God, so it was not counted among the territories given. I know you're like, whew, that's confusing. Yeah, it can get very confusing, but that's kind of the way it works in the text. All right, so who is Israel? Second question, how did they get to Egypt? Because that's where they are when Moses comes down to them. And the answer, of course, and I don't know, okay, I'll go back here. The answer goes to Joseph. And you see him there with a big yellow arrow pointing to him. You remember the story. Here's the sons of Jacob, but his favorite wife was Rachel, and her firstborn is Joseph. And so Joseph becomes his favorite son. Now, let me tell you, getting favorites will get you in trouble. My brother and sister both know that when my mom was alive, I was her favorite. I was the golden child. And they used to say that all the time. I love to kid my brother so much. I'll be with my brother tomorrow. We're going to go and meet them in West Tennessee and do a little camping. But one time, I called my brother up and I said, "Hey, I'm going to come down, and I thought maybe we could take Mother out of the nursing home and go and take her out to eat." And he said, "Okay, great." And I said, "Why don't you call Mama and tell her to get ready and we'll go out to eat?" And he said, "I'll do it." And so my brother calls my mom up and said, "Hey, Mom." He didn't say anything about me. He said, "Me and my wife were thinking about coming and getting you out of the nursing home and us going out to eat. Would you like to do that?" "No, I feel too bad. I've been sick all day. I can't go out to eat. No, but thank you." And then my brother said, "Okay, I'll tell Leslie you didn't want to go." "Oh, he's coming down? I didn't know he was coming down." "Yeah, I'll be ready. When are y'all going to get here?" My brother said, "Boy, you ain't right." I said, "I know it." That's the status you get as golden child, okay? And so one of my favorite stories to remind my brother. And so you remember the story. Joseph had gone out to check on his brothers who were tending the sheep. They saw him coming. He was wearing that coat that his dad had given him, that nobody else got a coat like that. Highly ornamental, beautiful coat. And the brothers are like, that's it. We've had enough of it. They take him, they strip off his coat, they throw him into a cistern, and then pull him out of the cistern and sell him as a slave into Egypt to the Ishmaelites. Ishmaelites, cousins of theirs. And they take Joseph and they take him down to Egypt, and he's bought by Potiphar there. You find that all in the book of Genesis. And then, of course, by the time you get to the end of the book, Joseph is risen to the second highest position in Egypt, probably the second highest in the world. People are needing to come to Egypt because of food. There's a great famine in the land. And so eventually he sends for all of his family. And so all those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his son's wives, numbered 66 persons. And eventually you get 70 in the number as they all go down to Egypt, and then they start growing. Now, that's how they got down there. What happened to them after they got there? That's the next question. How long were they in Egypt? Now, God had already told Abraham the answer to that question. Then the Lord said to him, this is Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. And so if you can just go back and plug all of this in, Joseph goes down to Egypt. He eventually brings all of his family down. Once they get down there, they're going to stay down there 400 years. And they're going to multiply. And you can imagine how quickly they multiplied because God blessed them. And they basically went from 70 to probably 1.5 million, 2 million people by the time Moses leads them out. And so you get this rapid increase over a 400-year period. Now, here's what I want to ask you. 400 years ago, 1622, what was going on? Now, Rodney, I expected you to answer that because you were about, 12 years old at that time? Oh, okay. Maybe not, Y'all got to allow me to pick on Rodney because Rodney is one of the oldest, most brilliant scholars I've ever known, and he just keeps going and going. I don't know, brother, how you do it. Whatever it is you're taking, unless it's Shackley, I want some of it. And if it's Shackley, I'll pass on that. Is it Shackley? Oh, it is Shackley. Okay, now I'm in trouble. I think I heard that the other night. Yeah, about you. But seriously, who can remember what's happening in 1622? King James is 11 years old, right? Yeah, Rodney's going to go back to the biblical story. King James has just come out in 1611. Wasn't accepted yet, except among a few people, but it had already come out. What was going on over here in this part of the world? Anybody remember? Indians. That's right. Jamestown is about 10 or 12 years old. Pilgrims have been at Plymouth Rock 2 years. 1620. There's nothing over here. Now, I want you to think about that. All of your ancestors, unless you have Jamestown relatives, which I happen to have, I've traced one of my ancestors back to Jamestown, but unless you've got Jamestown or Pilgrim relatives, all of your family members were still over in Europe. I want you to think about that. And by the way, can anybody name their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather from 1622? I suspect none of us can. And here's what's amazing about this, y'all. We have history books. We've got books that tell us all about this. They didn't. They didn't have any. All they had was oral history. And so I want you to understand the time frame from when they got down to Egypt to when they got out is like me and you going back to 1622. I mean, that's an enormous amount of time. And of course, during that time, what is going on? Well, what's going on is they're being enslaved. Notice the text. This is Exodus 1, verse 8. Then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. We don't know who that king was. We don't know which Pharaoh came to power. We don't know how long it took. That's one of the great questions to me of the book of Genesis and Exodus. I mean, were the Israelites in Egypt 100 years before they became slaves? 200 years? 300 years? How long were they as a people enslaved? And we don't know the answer to that question. But we know it was a long time. And of course, we also know that it was when they got large enough. Notice the text here. Look, he said to his people, Israelites have become far too numerous for us. And so the Israelites have grown to a pretty large size, and it would take a while to do that. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. Now, what has happened? Israel has come from a people who have been living prosperous down in the land of Goshen. They've grown to a great number. They've evidently become powerful. They're probably quite wealthy. And finally, God works through Pharaoh to then put them into slavery. And Pharaoh begins to mistreat them, and God prepares to lead them out. How long? We don't know. But long enough that they are in great misery. Now, let me just pause for a moment. I want you to think back to 1860s, American South. I want you to think about when the Emancipation Proclamation came out. We just got through a couple of weeks ago celebrating Juneteenth here in the United States, now a federal holiday. And it was the last of the announcements down in Texas that Abraham Lincoln had freed the slaves in the southern states. And one of the things that's fascinating is that we set the slaves free. But I want you to think about what they were then faced with. They're free. They don't own anything. They're not educated. Some of them are a little educated, but most of them are not educated. They've worked the fields. They know how to farm. They know how to build things, but they don't own any land. And you begin to ask yourself, how in the world do you even give people who have been enslaved that long a fighting chance when they're set free? Now ask that of the Israelites. People who've been enslaved, I don't know how long, but long enough that they're poor, they're beaten down, they are in trouble, yes, they can build buildings. I mean, they have the skills because they work in building these storehouses and probably temples and cities. And I mean, yes, they have manual skills, but they don't have, knowledge skills. So how did they even begin to be a nation? Which begins to answer the question of how does God work through Moses to make these people into his people? Because that's what's going on. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out in their cry for help because of slavery went up to God, and God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. And of course, that's what then leads us to this. How did God intervene? And it was through Charlton Heston. Some of y'all probably remember going to see that movie. 10 Commandments. Came out somewhere around, if I remember correctly, 1967, 68. One of the great movies at the time. Yul Brynner playing the role of Pharaoh, and Charlton Heston. This is Charlton Heston as he's in front of, the burning bush. But God appeared to Moses there at Mount Sinai in a burning bush. And you have this wonderful, wonderful message that God gives to Moses. The Lord said, I've indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I've come down to rescue them. And then look at verse 10. So now go. I love the way God operates. I've come to rescue them. Now, Rodney, you start teaching. Leslie, you start preaching. Elders, you start shepherding. I mean, I love God's plan, which is I'm going to do it, but I'm going to do it through you. And so he sends Moses. You go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, I want you to think how God has now shaped Moses. 40 years he had lived in Pharaoh's house. Then he went to visit his people, ended up murdering an Egyptian, and was forced to flee. 40 years now he spent in the wilderness. The very wilderness he's going to lead Israel back into, serving as a shepherd. I want you to think about Prince of Egypt, and now he's a lowly shepherd. And God's going to take both of those experiences and make him the greatest leader that the world had ever seen prior to probably Jesus. And so just a remarkable, remarkable preparation of this guy. And so Moses goes down and leads them out. And of course, they cross the Red Sea, and they go from slavery into freedom. But now the hard work begins. How in the world do you take this group of people and turn them into a nation? Again, you have to realize they don't know anything. I mean, can you imagine if someone came to church one Sunday and they're 22 years old and they sit down and you say to them, okay, take your Bible, and they go, what's a Bible? By the way, a lot of our professors at Lipscomb and Freed and Oklahoma Christian, all of our Harding, they're running into that more and more. And Rodney, you may have run into that before you had finished teaching, but students coming to classes, usually in freshman level classes, and you tell them, y'all remember Abraham, and someone raises their hand and go, who was Abraham? You talking about Abraham Lincoln? I mean, students who are coming to our Christian colleges who absolutely have no knowledge of Christianity in any sense, and you have to literally start from scratch. That is what Moses is doing, starting from scratch, and through God's leading, teaching Israel who they are. And so, why this book? Why write the book of Genesis? And that's where it gets interesting. To introduce Israel to her God. They know he's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But notice some of the things they don't know. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name then? Then why shall I tell them? Now, you can only conclude one of two things. Either Moses didn't know God's name or Israel didn't know God's name. And my guess is neither. They know that they serve a God who's the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they don't even know this God's name. And imagine if you have been a slave in Egypt. You know all the Egyptian gods. You know who Ra is, the god of the sun. I mean, you know who all these other different gods of the underworld and the Nile, and you just go on and on. The Egyptians have plenty of gods, and they know these gods' names, but they don't know their own God's name. And so Abraham has to teach them who their God is. And so it's not just that, but I want you to notice something else. This is Exodus 20:1-3. This is the beginning of the Ten Commandments. And I want you to notice where they are as God begins to work with them. I think a lot of times we miss this, okay? Judaism is oftentimes called one of the great world's monotheisms. In other words, they believe in only one God. Islam believes in God. Jews believe in God. Christians believe in God. We are the great monotheist, okay? But watch this. And God spoke all these words, I am Yahweh. You have there the tetragrammaton. You have these 4 letters that's the name of God that the Jews would not pronounce. And we don't know for sure it's pronounced Yahweh. We think it is. But this is the name of God. I am the Lord. I am Adonai. I am the one who led you out of Egypt. And then notice the very first of the 10 Commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. Isn't that interesting? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. I would think God would say, by the way, there are no other gods. Let's begin with the fact that there are no other gods. I am the only God there is. Only problem is you've got 1.5 million people who have lived all their life under Egyptian rule and their gods. You know about their gods. And you're fixing to go into Canaan where you've got Baal and Asheroth and all the gods of the Canaanites, the Moabites, the Edomites. I mean, you've got all these gods that you're going to encounter. And so trying to convince these people that there are no other gods except one God, that's going to take a long time. In fact, what's fascinating is when you start with Israel coming out of Egypt and going all the way through the period of the kings, even into the exile, Israel's still struggling. Is there but one God in the world? And if that's the case, why in the world is all this happening to us? And so God doesn't begin with, I'm the only God. You'd expect that. That's not how he begins. He says, you shall not have no other God, or you shall have no other gods before me. You'll not worship Baal. You'll not worship, Marduk. You'll not worship, you just plug in all the gods in the ancient world. And you don't worship them in front of me. And slowly but surely, God's going to lead them to monotheism, but it's going to take a long time to get there. You see, sometimes you've got to do a lot of unlearning before you do learning. And by the way, I think that's true of all of us. I know when I went to Freed, I had to have professors do a lot of deprogramming before they could start programming. You know, I'd been raised with a lot of teaching and a lot of preaching, and I was ready to take them on and for them to just kind of grin and look at me and say, you'll get it one of these days. In other words, I had to be deprogrammed before I could be programmed, and they're going to have to do the exact same thing. No other gods before me. And so this is kind of where we're going to go. We're going to begin next week in Genesis 1 as Moses begins the process of teaching kindergartners their ABCs. And that's exactly what he's doing. Now I want you to go back and remember, how did you learn your ABCs? Here's the way I learned them. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. By the way, that's also how I learned the books of the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Y'all are thinking right now, you're dense, aren't you? I am. To this day, if somebody says to me, can you name the 12 apostles? I go, sure. Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. You know, you get the song down, you got it, right? I mean, that's the way we are as a people. I suspect Moses used some mnemonic devices just like that. The generations of, the generations of. You remember what I put up there a while ago? The generations of. Boy, you get all those generations of and you'll know the story of Genesis. Well, we're going to look at how he began to create the world and how he helped Israel to learn the very basics about who he was. Thank you for being here today. Hope you have a great 4th of July. I know the fireworks show is tonight out at Drake's Creek. I asked one of the police officers, I said, where is the best place to be to see the fireworks show? And he said, not in Hendersonville. I said, oh, okay. I mean, he was like, boy, don't get around here. He's got to conduct all the traffic. So anyway, hope if you go see the fireworks show, hope you enjoy it. Let's pray as we dismiss. Father, thank you so much for our time together this morning. And Father, thank you for this wonderful book of Genesis. That Father helped Israel to know who she was and helps us to know who you are as well. And Father, we pray that as we study it this quarter, that you'll bless us as we work through this text. Help us to see what Moses was trying to teach your people back then so that